We talk a lot about coding interviews, but we don't talk much about actually getting the interview. So in this video, I want to look at 3 different resumes that I made. The first one will be my first ever real resume, and this is the resume I used to get an internship at Facebook, or at least to get the interview. The second is going to be from my junior year of college, which I used to get interviews at Google, Facebook, Lyft, and a bunch of other places. And then finally, we will use a more recent resume that I used to apply to full-time software engineering positions. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at this first resume. So this is from my sophomore year of college, so my second year, and I didn't have much experience yet, as well as I just didn't really know what making a good resume looked like. So if we look here first, just at the overall structure, I think it looks good from a visual standpoint, but the layout doesn't make a lot of sense. So first of all, I have this career objective here at the top, and we really just don't need this at all. This has no meaning. If you have one of these on your resume, I would highly recommend just removing it. It's basically a waste of space, and I don't want the first thing that somebody reads about me, so the first thing a recruiter sees, to be this generic career objective. So this is the first thing I would want to remove. And next, you need to order things based on how important they are. You need to be telling a story. So for example, as a student, you probably want to tell the story of being a student. What are the classes you've taken? Where are you going to school? What is your GPA? Things like that. And what are the skills that you have? And if you're later on in your career, then your story should be, these are the jobs I've had, so these are the things I have done. So in my case, I have technical skills at the top, which I think is fine, but really I think the education should be moved up above technical skills, just because education here is probably the most important part of my resume at this point in time. And then we have professional experience, which I think is fine. It's probably easier to just word this as work experience. We also have related coursework, which can probably just be part of education, but I do think this is actually something good that I did, and we will go into that in a moment. And then we have some personal projects, which again, I think is good to have as an early resume when you don't have a lot of work experience. Okay, so let's start looking at some of this content. So at the top here, we have my name, which is good. And then we have this address. I've redacted a bit of it, but there's no need for this. The recruiter does not care where you live. They're not going to send you mail. They're not going to come to your address. So this is just a waste of space. You can put the city you live in. I think that is good, but putting the entire address is just not worth it. I also have a phone number here. It's questionable if you need a phone number because really they're not going to call you. So there's not much need for a phone number either. And then I have my email. I think this is fine. I used a school email at the time, although I might recommend not doing that. The reason being, I actually don't have access to that email anymore now that I graduated. So if I want to apply to one of these companies that I applied to in the past, I no longer have the contact information for those recruiters. So I would probably recommend using a personal email unless you know that you will be able to keep access to your school email. Okay, so that's the top. The career objective, I'm just going to completely skip over because it just shouldn't be there. And next, let's go into the technical skills. So I broke this down into web programming, object-oriented programming, data analysis, and statistical programming, and other technologies. And I think the issue here is that it's just sort of all over the place. You want to be telling a story with your resume, and here I'm not telling any story. I'm telling the story of sort of a jack of all trades. I don't know what I want to be doing. Now, it's fine to have some back-end and front-end technologies, but having data analysis on the same resume as web programming and object-oriented programming just doesn't make sense. Am I trying to be a data scientist or a software engineer or something completely different? It's not super clear here. So with web programming, I think this is fine. This is what I ended up spending most of my career so far doing. So this is good being on top. Object-oriented programming is a little bit odd of a section. I might combine this and just have it be programming languages. I would also maybe change this to have it based on knowledge. So maybe things I'm proficient in, and then languages I have some experience in, because I don't really want to be tested on all of this. For example, I didn't know jQuery all that well, so I wouldn't really want to be tested on it. So it probably either shouldn't be on my resume or should be listed just as something I have some experience with. And in other technologies, some of this is just unrelated. So Unity 3D is okay to be on here, but I'm not really trying to be a game developer. so I'm not sure that it makes much sense. I also have Adobe Creative Cloud, which I think can just be removed. There's no need to tell them that I know how to edit a video or something like that. And this is also just not specific. There are probably 20 different pieces of software in the Adobe Creative Cloud. So this doesn't really say, do I know how to edit videos or photos or something completely different? So I'm not sure how useful this is either. Okay, so let's come down to professional experience now. And first of all, we have this TA position. So we can see the actual employer, which was the computer science department. So the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science. And then we have the position, which was that I was a web programming teaching assistant. And we have the time frame. So this had started in September 2017 and was until present. I don't know exactly how long this had been. I think I was using this resume in early to mid 2018. So this had been a little bit under a year, I would guess. And we have 3 different bullets, which I think are okay bullets. So each one starts with a verb, which is good. So we don't need to have I supported, it should just be supported. So we want to start with an action verb and then give some context or some information on what you actually did, which is what I do here. So for example, I taught students the basics of web development through HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, and SQL. The one thing that is missing, and I think almost all of these are missing this, is going to be a result. So what was the result of doing this? And we don't really have that in any of these bullets, but again, I think these bullets are decent. And then below this, we have UW IT, Learning Technologies, Digital Video Instructor. So this was a bit of an unrelated job, but I think it was still fine to have because I didn't have a lot of experience at this time, but you will see in the later resumes, this does drop off. But essentially, I was teaching video editing classes on campus. And I was actually doing this concurrently, so November 2016 to present. So I was doing both this and TAing at the same time, which I do not recommend trying to do 2 jobs at once. I eventually did quit this job a little bit after this resume. But anyways, let's move on. So next we have education. So I went to the University of Washington in Seattle. I added Seattle here just because there are a few University of Washington campuses, so just to be super clear there. And then I have my GPA. At the time, I guess it was a 3.7. With GPAs, I would usually say if it's above a 3.5, always include it. If it's in the range of like 3.0 to 3.5, it's sort of up to you if you want to include it. I don't think it's going to hurt, but it's probably not going to help a whole lot either. And below a 3.0, I would usually say don't include a GPA. And then we have my intended degree, which was a Bachelor of Science in Informatics. I say intended because I wasn't actually in the major yet. And then I mentioned a business entrepreneurship minor, which I was intending at the time to do. I actually never did it. So I took a couple of the classes, but did not end up doing this minor. And then it says I'm a second-year student with junior standing, which I sort of cringe a little bit seeing this. Don't do this. Just say second-year student or sophomore. You don't need to tell them you're standing. This was a common thing at UW. I don't know if it's common at every school, but people would come in with a lot of AP credits, and then they would say that they are a junior with standing, but they really would just be a second-year student. If you're planning to graduate early, this is fine, but I wasn't, so honestly, I think it was just a little bit misleading. So I would remove this if I was doing this again. And then we have related coursework. Again, I would combine this with education, but I think this is really good to have. So if you are a student, there are a wide range of students, and you want to tell the recruiters in a simple way that, yes, I know the knowledge that I need to succeed at this job and to pass your interviews. And I think that's what this really does. So first of all, we say that I took Introductory Programming 1 and 2, which just tells them that I know how to code. And then we have Web Programming, which is that class I was TAing. And the most important one is Data Structures and Algorithms, which I guess was in progress at the time. So I was taking it while this resume was being used. But this is super important because interviews are going to come from this class. So telling recruiters that I took this class was like telling them, hey, I am qualified to pass your interviews. Then I mention a few other classes that are a little bit less related. So we have Social Networking Technologies, Gender and Information Technologies, Intellectual Foundations of Informatics, Technical Foundations of Informatics, and Professionalism in Informatics. So you can see I hadn't taken many classes in the informatics major yet. I hadn't even been admitted to the major yet, so I couldn't take most of the high-level classes. So these are a bit all over the place, but as a freshman, sophomore, or even a junior, you won't be expected to have taken every class there is. So I think this is fine. And then I have 2 personal projects. These actually both came from hackathons. So this first one, I think we pronounced this ReMed, if I remember correctly. So we got second place at the hackathon we did this in. And then there is a bullet point basically explaining what it did. And I actually think this is a decent bullet point, except for the fact that it doesn't start with an action verb, but this does explain what exactly the project was. It also would probably be helpful to explain the technology we used to create it. So I mentioned here that it is a project that takes HTML and converts it into R Markdown, but it doesn't actually say the programming languages we used to do that. And then I have this Pathologic project, which was a game. It started as a hackathon project, and then I worked on it a little bit after the fact. I never actually completely finished it, but I think that's still fine to have on the resume. So this one was a multi-platform turn-based game utilizing algorithmic level generation. So I think that's a pretty good bullet point, just because it describes sort of the context of the game, not in the way the game works, because that's not super important, but rather how I built the game. And then it says it was developed using Unity 3D. It also probably would have been good to link to GitHub for both of these. I don't think I ever put either of these projects on GitHub, but that is something I probably should have done. Okay, so that's the end of this first resume. Again, I don't think this resume is perfect. In fact, I think, as we just saw, there is a lot wrong with it. So let's move on to my resume from my junior year. And this one is going to be, I think, a little bit better. And at this point, I did have the Facebook internship. So you can see how, because of that internship, I sort of shift my focus with the resume a little bit. So this is the new one. I used a different template here. I think this template is actually a little bit worse. I kind of like the previous one better, but regardless, I did change the template. So up here at the top, we have my name, we have a phone number, an email, and I did change it to just Seattle, Washington. So I removed my actual address, which I think is good. And now at this point, I thought that the fact that I had interned at Facebook was probably the most important thing I had done. So I actually chose to put work experience over education. I sort of debated this a little bit, but I thought that that was the better decision. So work experience is first, and we have that I worked at Facebook as a software engineering intern. We see the time frame, and then we have 4 different bullets. So I have the most bullet points about this because I thought that this was by far the most impressive thing that I had done. So first of all, we have that I developed and shipped a new productivity tool for interactively splitting commits, lowering commit sizes, and reducing average code review times. So I think this is a much better bullet point than anything we saw on the previous resume because it describes what I did. It starts with an action verb, and then it actually has an outcome. So what happened because of this? It could be better if it had an actual number. So maybe I reduced code review times by 10% or something like that, but I don't think I actually had that data. So this was the best I could do. And then we have a few more bullet points. So improving version control. I wrote some unit tests, which I think is a good thing to mention on resumes, just because recruiters like to see that you have some experience doing testing. And then I mentioned at the bottom the languages and frameworks that I was using. So this was JavaScript with React, Redux, RxJS, and Flow. So I think this is a decent bullet point. I could have probably just included this in the other bullet points, but I think it's fine to be its own at the bottom. Next, we have the teaching assistant job. Again, I was still a teaching assistant, but I'd been promoted to be the head teaching assistant, so I updated the resume to reflect that. And it has a few more bullet points than it did prior because I am doing a little bit more in this role. So now I actually occasionally got to lecture on sort of some extra material, such as React. And then I also changed up a little bit of the other bullets, but not too much. And then below that, we have the same student assistant job where I was teaching video editing. I'm not sure why I changed it to say student assistant. I think that sounds worse than what it was before, but student assistant is fine. And it says sort of the same thing that I was teaching these video editing classes. At this point, I think I probably could have removed this from the resume. You'll see I removed my personal projects, which I actually think was a mistake. At this point, I thought Facebook would kind of just carry the resume and all of the other stuff was sort of useless. So I tried to remove a lot of it, but I think having those personal projects would have been good. And I probably could have removed this video editing teaching position because it was super unrelated, whereas the personal projects were related and it shows some level of passion and commitment to software engineering. Okay, so next we have education. So University of Washington, Seattle, once again. Now I am actually in the major, so I just say BS in informatics. And then I have June 2020, which is when I was going to be graduating. So I didn't have the degree yet at this point, but I think it's fine to just have a date in the future, and that implies that you don't have the degree yet. And then I have my GPA again. At this point, I guess it was a 3.76. And then I also have the coursework. So I broke it down into informatics and computer science. So the reason I did this is because I wasn't a computer science major, but I wanted to show that I'd taken computer science classes. So I thought it was useful to sort of break it up into info and computer science classes. I thought that was sort of a clever way to sort of show them that, yes, I have computer science experience, even though that is not my major. So in info, you can see now I've taken a few more beefy classes. So we have computer networks. We also have client-side development and databases. I probably could have removed a few of these classes like professionalism and informatics. What even is that? It was actually a great class, but it doesn't really say much on a resume. So that probably could have been removed along with a few other classes. For example, social networking technology sounds kind of cool, but it was a very introductory class, so I'm not sure that it really has a place on the resume. And then computer science, we have data structures, algorithms, machine learning, web programming, programming languages, and compilers. So these are the classes I had taken in CS at that point. And then below this, we have technical skills. But I think I did a better job with technical skills on this resume than the previous one. So on this resume, I have it in proficient languages, knowledgeable languages, and other technologies. So basically what I'm saying here is these proficient ones are the ones I know well. Feel free to test me on them. And knowledgeable languages are the things that I might have worked on at some point, but by putting them down here, I think it's safe to say that I wouldn't really be tested on them in an interview, or if somebody asks me questions about them, I could safely say, well, I don't have a ton of experience using it. I used it for X, Y, or Z project, so I don't know the answer. And I think that would have been fine. So here we have Java, JavaScript, and Python as proficient languages. Knowledgeable, I say PHP, R, SQL, C#, and Swift. And then other technologies, we have some frameworks as well as Git, Mercurial, HTML, CSS, and Unity 3D. So this is better than before because we got rid of things like Adobe Creative Cloud, but I think I still could have narrowed it down a little bit more. So for example, Unity 3D just does not really need to be on here. And I also probably should have separated libraries such as React away from things like Git because those are two completely separate types of knowledge. But okay, so I think this resume is actually pretty good. I did get a lot of interviews this year, so I think it worked pretty well. But now let's look at my third resume, and this is going to be when I was applying to new grad roles. So we can see the font is getting a little bit smaller just because I have more experience, and I think this template looks a lot better as well. So we still have the single column layout, but at the top now, I have gotten rid of Seattle altogether, and I just have my email, my LinkedIn, and my GitHub. I'm not sure if having a GitHub on here actually mattered all that much. I don't think anyone ever looked at it, and honestly, there just wasn't much impressive on my GitHub, but I did decide to include it. And then I did switch to having education first. I thought that the fact that I was a student and applying for new grad roles, it made sense to have education at the top, even though I did have these sort of impressive internships. I thought that that was a better decision. And then I have my work experience, which is the majority of this resume. And at the bottom, we have technical skills. So going up to the top with education, pretty much the same thing, Bachelor's of Science in Informatics. With my GPA, I guess at this point it was a 3.81, and we have my expected graduation date. And then we have relevant coursework, basically the same thing as before. I'd taken a few more classes than the year prior, so I changed out some of those, but it is basically the same thing. But I do think this one was a little bit easier to read in this format. And then we have work experience. So at this point, I'd done my first Facebook internship, I'd done a Lyft internship, and I was planning to do another Facebook internship. So at the top, we have the Facebook internship that is upcoming. So I had no bullet points here because I hadn't actually done it yet, but I thought it was still good to show recruiters that I have this third internship. So I just say upcoming fall 2019. And then I have my Lyft internship. And in this Lyft internship, I worked on more of an infrastructure team. So that's sort of reflected in these bullet points. So I built a new platform for normalizing Python and Go testing, standardizing the engineering workflow, and improving test coverage across the codebase. So I think this is a really strong bullet because, again, it sort of has a verb and then what I did and then why it mattered. And then the same is true for the other bullets, so they all sort of follow that same format, and I think they were just much stronger bullets than I had in years prior. And then we have my teaching assistant job again. At this point, it looks on my resume like I had left, but really I just wasn't taking classes at that time, so I couldn't TA. I did actually go back and TA this class again, but it looks like it ended in June of 2019, which is fine. And then we have the other Facebook internship, so the one that I did first. The bullet points are roughly the same, and we have the teaching assistant job. So I actually broke up being a TA and a head TA into two different sections. I don't think I should have done this. I think I should have just had head TA because it was the same job, just with a different title. I think breaking it up made it a little bit confusing. And then I ended up with this Facebook internship in the middle, which just chronologically was a bit confusing. So I think it's fine how it is. But looking back, I think I should have removed the bottom one. So this one down here, where I just say that I was a teaching assistant, combine those bullet points into the one with the head teaching assistant, and use the extra space to include a personal project. And then finally, at the bottom, we have technical skills. This changed again, although not as much as before. So we have proficient languages and frameworks. So I no longer put frameworks as other tools. So here we have Java, Python, JavaScript, React, and Redux. And then we have knowledgeable languages and frameworks. Honestly, this could probably just be removed. These are all things that I sort of knew but didn't know very well. So I'm not sure how much value this actually has on the resume. And then we have tools, which was Git, Mercurial, Linux, Jest, JUnit, PyTest, Firebase, and Unity 3D. Again, I think this is fine, although some of this is probably a bit unnecessary. For example, I think I have 3 different testing frameworks here, and these pretty much all work the same, just in different languages, so I'm not sure it makes sense to have all 3, as well as Unity 3D. Again, I would probably remove. Firebase, I think, is fine, especially if you're applying to some smaller companies that might use it, although I'm not sure how much weight it holds if you're applying to a big tech company. For example, Facebook is not going to be using Firebase or anything like that. I think instead it would have been good to include something like AWS here, although I just didn't have experience using that. Okay, so that's going to do it for the third resume. I actually don't have a current resume. I haven't had a use for one over the last few years, but if you are interested, then maybe I will make one to show it off in another video. And with that said, I hope you did enjoy this video and learned something from it. If you did, make sure to like it and subscribe for future content. And I will see you in the next video.